friends. And on the behalf of the PHO chapter and the curriculum committee of this program, I welcome you all to the weekly pediatric hematology oncology training session for the fellows. So first of all, I should thank Dr. Arpita for volunteering for today's session, and she has put together exciting session today on bone tumors with a very esteemed and well-known faculty. So thank you, Dr. Arpita, for that. So first of all, let me introduce all the experts and the moderator for today. Dr. Arpita Bhattacharya, we all know her. She's a senior consultant at Tata Medical Center in Calcutta, and she is going to be moderating today's session and also delivering the didactic. Yeah, she has put together, a very esteemed expert panel from various, I would say, specialties, and as we all know, bone tumors are a teamwork, and she has put together other allied specialty experts in the panel today. We have Dr. Maya Prasad. Dr. Maya Prasad, all we know, she's a consultant at the Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai. We also Dr. Ramya. Ramya is a consultant pediatric hematology oncology at Apollo Chennai. We have Dr. Raghu KS also. Dr. Raghu is Arpita's colleague. He's a consultant at Tata Medical Center, Calcutta. And we have, as I said, two experts from other fields. We have Dr. Kaushik, who is one of my colleagues from Narayana Health City in Calcutta, NH Calcutta. He's basically alumni of Tata Medical Center, and he practices pediatric orthopedic oncology. So welcome, Dr. Kaushik. Dr. Rimpa Achari, she is a radiation oncologist. She works in Tata Medical Center at Kolkata. So welcome all, and thank you for sparing your time this afternoon to be sharing your experiences with us. We have got 3 case presenters. All the 3 are fellows at Tata Medical Center, Calcutta, and we have got Dr. Ritu, Dr. Dipankar, and Shravya presenting the cases today. So I welcome you all for today's session, and over to you, Dr. Arpita, for the next 1.5 hours. Thank you very much. As I've been requesting before, these are interactive sessions. We decided that we won't be sharing these videos straight away after they are hot from the press. There'll be some delay now in sharing videos because we want people to participate. So keep your videos on, please. This is for the students especially, and please ask questions and doubts to the faculty. Thank you, Dr. Arpita.
Good afternoon, everyone, friends, colleagues, and our very beloved juniors. Thank you, Sunil, and thank you, Anand, for giving us the opportunity of talking about malignant bone tumors. And those of us who work in pediatric solid tumors know that these tumors can be extremely challenging to diagnose as well as to treat. And as Sunil has already pointed out, it takes a multidisciplinary approach, entire teams working together to get these tumors out of the way. So without much ado, let us just begin. So in this session, we are going to talk about 2 main malignant bone tumors. One is osteosarcoma and the other one is Ewing sarcoma. As far as osteosarcoma is concerned, we are going to be discussing the evolution of chemotherapy, because as Anand gave me this topic, I started thinking of what to talk about in osteosarcoma, because this is one tumor where we have stubbed our toes and we are stuck for the last 30 years or so, haven't made much advance. But the evolution of chemotherapy in osteosarcoma is actually a fascinating, and it tells us how we make progress by trial and error. Next, I'm going to give a very short session on diagnostic advances in Ewing sarcoma. And then we have case presentations on both osteosarcoma and Ewing sarcoma. And thank you, Sunil, for presenting all our expert panelists. Okay, so let us talk about osteosarcoma. The first time I had heard of osteosarcoma, I was in class 7, and I was reading Arthur Haley's The Final Diagnosis. People of this generation probably haven't read it, but Arthur Haley was very hot in our days. We used to love his books. And in the final diagnosis, there was this pathologist called Pearson, who's a protagonist in this book, a very bad-tempered old man on the verge of retirement. And this young girl gets a tumor at the lower end of the femur. And this book was published in 1959. And in those days, the only treatment for bone tumors was amputation. So this girl had an amputation. So that was the upfront management of osteosarcoma way back in 1959. But this generation is very familiar with John Green. And even if you haven't read the book, I'm sure all of you have seen the movie, The Fault in Our Stars. And in Fault in Our Stars, Gus, the protagonist again, the very dashing hero, he has osteosarcoma. He's an amputee. And then it all comes back. So that's relapsed osteosarcoma. And of course, I mean, the poor chap dies. And the poor girl had also died in final diagnosis. So osteosarcoma doesn't look so good after all. So how did osteosarcoma chemotherapy evolve? So first of all, way back in the 1960s and 1970s, there wasn't much happening. They would amputate, and then sometimes they would give radiotherapy and then wait for the disease to take over. And people would almost invariably die. So the first studies were historical control studies. And when I was searching the literature, I found these two papers published in 1974. This is before most of you were even born. And the first paper talked about adjuvant methotrexate, and citrovorin factor, by the way, is leucovorin. I had to Google it to find out what it was. So adjuvant methotrexate and citrovorin factor in treatment of osteosarcoma. And the other paper in the same issue of the journal was amputation and adriamycin in primary osteosarcoma. So just let's look at what these papers had to say at that time. In the first one, where methotrexate was used, there were 20 patients who had no visible metastasis. Those were the days where CT scans were not available and X-rays were the only modality that people had. These patients, they had upfront operation or radiation, and then they had some adjuvant chemotherapy every 3 weeks with vincristine and a 6-hour infusion of methotrexate. And they didn't use much. They used about 3 grams per square meter of methotrexate. And then citrovorin or leucovorin was given 6-hourly for 12 doses. And the control was 98 patients who were seen in that institute between 1950 and 1972. And they saw that 19 out of these 20 patients actually survived for any duration of time. And these patients, they didn't metastasize to the lungs. In the second study, there were 21 patients who were given adjuvant doxorubicin after amputation, 6 courses, 4 to 6 weekly, and 19 out of 21 patients survived. 5 relapsed, 2 local and 3 distal, and at 18 months, almost 71% were expected to be free of tumor, determined by the life table analysis. So these 2 studies showed that adjuvant chemotherapy did work in osteosarcoma. And adriamycin was delaying gross mets growing in the lungs. Now, historical control studies, we know, are not a very good idea because there are too many differences between what you're doing now and what happened later. Whenever now we try to put up a study, we try to avoid historical controls and we try to do randomized control studies. So let us see what osteosarcoma did, what was done in osteosarcoma as far as RCTs were concerned. This is a publication again in NEAM in 1986, and this is one of the earliest RCTs which showed the effect of adjuvant chemotherapy in progression-free survival in patients with extremity osteosarcoma. So this was one of the first RCTs with definitive surgery, and then the patients were randomized to not receiving any chemotherapy versus receiving chemotherapy. 36 patients were thus randomized, and it was seen that relapse-free survival was very poor, less than 20% in the control group. And this was almost parallel to the historical studies. And 66% in the adjuvant chemotherapy group. So for the first time, now you can say for sure that adjuvant chemotherapy is probably working. P-value was less than 0.001. There were 77 additional patients who could not actually be analyzed because they had refused randomization, but they elected either observation or chemotherapy. And in this cohort of patients, also similar results were seen. So that was, in 1986, a big step forward. Now, what is the best chemotherapy to give to these patients? So in another study, this was a bigger study, which was published in 1992. So 6 years later, there were 198 eligible patients. And this you can get only when you do multicentric studies, because osteosarcoma, all said and done, is not a very common tumor. So of 198 eligible patients, there were 2 arms. So one arm, arm A, got doxorubicin, cisplatin, and every 3 weekly. And in the second group, they got doxorubicin, cisplatin, but 10 days before doxorubicin, cisplatin, they were given 8 grams per square meter of high-dose methotrexate as a 6-hour infusion. Because they were doing it on day 1 and then day 10 again, the cycles became longer. So it became 4.5 weekly cycles. And for some reason, whereas in the previous arm, 6 cycles were given, in this they only gave 4 cycles. The 5-year disease-free survival was seen to be a bit higher in the doxorubicin cisplatin group without the high-dose methotrexate, but overall survival was not too different. Now, the important thing here that out of these 198 eligible patients, there was histopathologic data on the resected specimen in 66 patients. And it was seen that those patients who had neoadjuvant chemotherapy and showed good necrosis, more than 90% necrosis, they did better. So this was the first time that it was demonstrated that how much of an influence on the ultimate outcome there is if there is good necrosis, good response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy. But now, if we take this study at face value, what are we going to see? We are going to see that high-dose methotrexate is not really needed. I mean, the doxorubicin arm actually did better, didn't it? 57 versus 41%. But there's a caveat there. So what are we going to do? Only 8 grams per square meter of high-dose methotrexate was used. There was lower dose intensity because it was every 4.5 weeks and very few cycles, just 4 cycles. So what do you expect? So they decided, the researchers decided to take it further, not to take this study. It was a valuable study. So it showed that methotrexate is an active agent, cisplatin is an active agent, as is doxorubicin. So to take this one step further, the European Osteosarcoma Intergroup study decided to take a multi-drug arm. So they threw in whatever they had: high-dose methotrexate, doxorubicin, bleo, cyclophos, dactinomycin, vincristine, cisplatin. Is there anything left in the pharmacy? So they took everything and they tried it, but it was seen that just 2 agents, cisplatin, doxorubicin, actually did better. And you ended up with a huge amount of toxicity when you threw in all these drugs. So what was the next step? So what is better? Nobody knows. So let's look at some meta-analysis. Right. So Van Dalen et al. In a Cochrane database system view showed that there was not enough evidence to approve of high-dose methotrexate in osteosarcoma. And in another study, another meta-analysis, we found that regimens containing at least 3 drugs got in cancer cells, and we are using it to our advantage. What's happening is when you're giving very high dose methotrexate, the methotrexate is entering the normal cells through this carrier mechanism, but it is entering the cancer cells because of the diffusion gradient. If you're using a lot of it, there's a lot of it outside, it is just entering the cancer cells. Leucovorin is entering the cancer cells, but leucovorin will never have that huge concentration in the serum. That is why you need a very good serum methotrexate level for it to be effective. So leucovorin will, when you're giving leucovorin, it cannot enter the cancer cells because we don't have the carrier. It will enter just the normal cells and it will rescue the normal cells. And the malignant cells will have DNA synthesis disruption and they're going to die. So here you can see that over the last so many years, this is data from 1991, the survival in osteosarcoma hasn't improved much, no matter what the trial. So what people decided to do, they all put their heads together and the EURAMOS trials began. So the EURAMOS 1 trial wanted to see if addition of ifosfamide etoposide improved outcome. It was a much, much larger study because it was the European and the American group all together. 618 patients. And it was seen that with MAP-IE, there was a lot more toxicity, but no real advantage. And histologic response provides prognostic information. But if you see bad histology after neoadjuvant, at resection, what are you going to do about it? There's zero you can do about it because there are no new agents. So future clinical trials are not going to include the histologic response. You can always tell the family, this looks very bad, there's no response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy, but there's zero you can do to actually improve that outcome. So the future is, see, you know that there are two germline defects. One is Li-Fraumeni syndrome, where there is predisposition to osteosarcoma, and the other is germline RB-mutated retinoblastomas who are prone to osteosarcoma. So these two pathways, there is something there which predisposes to osteosarcomas. So the target research program, it wants to look at a very large sample set with integrated genomic analysis, which will give us better understanding of the pathogenesis of osteosarcoma and maybe give us future inroads into treating this very difficult disease. Okay, now let's just quickly go over a few pathologic things about Ewing sarcoma. James Ewing was a man who wore many hats, and he first described a tumor which was not quite osteosarcoma, which was not myeloma, so it was a different kind of tumor. And we all know it's a small round blue cell tumor. So James Ewing called it a diffuse endothelioma. Oberlin in 1929 called it a reticulosarcoma. But finally in 1958, Hodman gave the name of Ewing tumor to this. So what's the difference between Ewing sarcoma and a PNET? Because a lot of the time, especially students, they worry about whether they are the same tumor or whether they should call it something else. But it is actually one and the same thing. The hallmark is, previously we used to think that PNETs have a more aggressive course, and if it is outside the bone, you should call it a PNET. But we know that basically they are one and the same thing, and there's not much difference in the survival between these two entities. So now it is all brought under the Ewing sarcoma family of tumors. So Ewing sarcoma of the bone, extraosseous Ewing, PNET or peripheral neuroepithelioma, Askin tumor of the chest, and Ewing sarcoma of the organs, especially of the kidney and the retroperitoneum. They all come from the same type of the stem cell, that is the neuroectodermal or the mesenchymal stem cell. You know all the sites, they come from the diaphysis of the long bones, pelvic bones, ribs, sometimes flat bones like the skull bones, vertebra, scapula, small bones of hand and feet. Any soft tissue site can be affected. So here you can see something arising from the scapula. Here, this is from the skull bones, this is extremity, and this is from a metacarpal. So it can arise from anywhere really. Here there are some more images, so you know it can occur in bones and then have skip lesions to other bones and easily metastasizes to the lungs. Now let us quickly talk about CD99, because whenever you order IHCs for Ewing sarcoma, CD99 is something that you always look forward to. It has a sensitivity of 87 to 100%, but the specificity is variable because a lot of other tumors, including desmoplastic small round cell tumors, small cell osteos, RMS, lymphoblastic lymphomas, myeloid sarcomas, and synovial sarcomas can all be CD99 positive. So CD99 is membrane positive. So the cell membrane looks like a mesh and it takes up the CD99. On the other hand, the nucleus takes up other dyes like FLI1, and you can see here the nuclear positivity of FLI1. So there is translocation between EWSR1 and FLI1, which is found in almost 83% of Ewing sarcoma. And in the others, in the remaining 10% or so, the EWSR1 fuses with ERG. So this The EWSR1 FLI1 is T1122. It can be T2122, and sometimes there can be other areas also. So let's look at that. What happens there? What happens is, this is the EWS1R1 gene, and this is the ETS family of fusion partners. This has the amino terminal end, this has the carboxy terminal, and this fusion causes the cancer. What happens? This is the mesenchymal stem cell. It has its oncogene switched off, and it has its tumor suppressor gene switched on, as should happen in any normal cell. But when this EWS FLI1 translocation happens, it introduces amino acid sequence repeats in nucleic acid sequence repeats in the closed chromatin. So the closed chromatin is open now, the oncogenes get turned on. On the other hand, there are multiple DGAA over here. This is turned off. And then the differentiation genes, the tumor suppression genes, get turned off. So this leads to the cancer because of this fusion. How do we detect it? We detect it by the Ewing sarcoma break-apart probe. So every cell has a copy of the EWS and the ERG group. So one is green, one is red, and the fusion would look orange like this. Now, what do we have here? So EWSR1 can combine with FLI1, it can combine with ERG, and this would be the majority. But rarely it would combine with the FUS and ERG. So the EWSR1 is not involved at all. FUS is involved. Sometimes, rarely, VCOR is involved. Sometimes CIC is involved. So if you don't get EWSR1 positivity, it does not mean that this tumor is not Ewing sarcoma. So we are all familiar with Archie, and we know how he carried on with both Betty and Veronica. So the EWS is very happily carrying on with a lot of other girls. So it can combine with FLI1. If it does, then or ERG or ETV1, ETV4. In that case, you get Ewing sarcoma and PNET. If it combines with WT1, you get desmoplastic small round cell tumor. If it combines with TEC, you get extraskeletal myxoid chondrosarcoma. And if it combines with 12q13, you can get myxoid liposarcomas. So one Archie wearing many, many hats, going out with different girls, being a different person altogether. So we know that when it combines with FLI1 or ERG, it is CD99 positive, strongly positive, and it's more than 85% will occur in the bones. So Ewing sarcoma is a very rare molecular event where only FUS is involved. So what like sarcomas? Because sometimes you're going to get a report saying this is an Ewing-like sarcoma. It's a undifferentiated round cell sarcomas, which morphologically look like classical ES. But the EWSR1 ETS fusion is not present. And the second most common type of round cell sarcoma. So you're going to get it all the time. EWSR1 is going to come negative. So you can then maybe call it the Ewing-like tumor. There are four main types. We have already discussed this: CIC rearrange, VCOR rearrange, non-ETS fusion, and some of them you just can't classify. They are far too clever for us. So the genomic landscape of Ewing sarcoma is actually very, very huge. We know that very aggressive pediatric solid tumors have very stable genomes. They don't budge at all. And oncogenesis is not because of frequent mutation. It is because of epigenetic deregulation. And the Ewing sarcoma has to have fusion protein of EWS ETS. And these translocations are the event that are critical in the oncogenic process. This sets off the oncogenic process. We know about this EWS FLI1 arrangement for more than 20 years, but we've not been able to take any advantage of that because we haven't been able to target it at all. So we need more insight in this. We have to see what new targeted therapy we can get. And there are some recurrent somatic mutations which have been reported in Ewing sarcoma, especially TP53. TP53 is even more clever than our Archie of the Archie comics. He's there with every girl that you can imagine. So TP53 is responsible for so many tumors, and also STAT2. But none of this are producing any druggable targets. So this is difficult now. And at relapse, this is something very important that I would like to tell everyone. At relapse, the frequency of genetic aberrances is significantly higher. So maybe you didn't have any aberrance in the first instance, but at relapse, you might get it. And the diagnostic and relapse tumors may be quite different. So if there is relapse, a rebiopsy is warranted in case you want to give some precision-based therapy. But targetable lesions are few and far between. So it is going to be really difficult. So thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the lecture. And with your permission, Sunil, should we move on to the case presentations? Or do we have any questions here?
That would be okay, Dr. Arpita, to go ahead. But I wanted to just, kind of thank and congratulate for a fantastic, overview you gave, and that the correlations which you draw are really interesting. So that gives a Dr. Arpita flavor to the whole thing. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
If I permit to ask one question.
Yeah.
This is, sometimes our fellows also have been asking, that is, translocation along with one of these mutations, somatic mutations, whether it's STAG2 or P53. So I know whether you were discussing that later on in your cases. So what is that implication of those where there's a both the lesions are together?
I don't know. I have an answer to that.
All right. So I think then you can proceed with the. Okay, proceed with the cases, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Ritu, who is a fellow in our department, and she's going to be presenting the first case.
Good afternoon. Our first case is a 13-year-old girl from West Bengal.
Ria, can we mute all the participants except for the host and the co-host, please?
So I'm just doing that. Yeah, it's done.
So our first case is a 13-year-old girl from West Bengal. She presented to us with complaint of pain in the right heel for 1 year and progressive swelling in the same foot for 9 months. She was evaluated outside with CT scan showing an osteolytic lesion, MRI right ankle joint showing and CT thorax and abdomen was normal. She had done incision biopsy of the lesion with histopathological report showing small round cell tumor with IHC of CD99 and FLI1 positive, which was suggestive of Ewing sarcoma. So she came to us for further evaluation and management. On examination, she was otherwise well, except for the finding of a swelling on the right foot, extending from the heel to the ankle joint, which was non-inflammatory, non-tender. There was a biopsy scar on the lateral aspect, which was tender, and there was restriction of the movement at the ankle joint. There were no local regional lymphadenopathies found. So we did an X-ray of the right foot, which showed sclerotic lytic lesion involving the right calcaneum with distortion of the bony alignment and joint spaces involving the talus and the lower end of tibia, and also with the minimal adjacent soft tissue swelling. We reviewed the doc of biopsy done outside, which was consistent with Ewing sarcoma.
Okay, Kaushik, are you there? Dr. Kaushik Nandi?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Okay, Kaushik, my question to you is, how ideally should biopsies be done in any malignant bone tumor? This is a child who came to us with a ready diagnosis. So I had a biopsy tissue, which on review showed that this was indeed. Sometimes when children just present with bone tumors, how should we go around doing the biopsy?
The biopsy should be the last protocol in the protocol of the diagnostic procedures. After all the investigations, means all the imaging investigations are exhausted, means X-ray, MRI or CT scan, whatever is required specific to the location and the presumed diagnosis of the tumor. So depending on who is ideal to do the biopsy, he or she may be a radiologist or a surgeon, but someone who is conversant with the definitive surgical planning of the specific tube and concerned to the specific anatomical location. So anyone from the sarcoma team who is conversant with the definitive surgery incision line can do the biopsy. It may be he or she may be a surgeon, oncosurgeon, or a radiologist. For difficult to approach areas like an axial skeleton, or where the co-needle biopsy without image guidance is not possible, for that matter, definitely can be done. So that is the basic principle. So along the line of the definitive surgical incision, the biopsy mark has to be there. That has to be representative, mostly from the solid component of the tumor, avoiding the necrotic component. Otherwise, the biopsy material will be non-representative. And between the incision or open biopsy and the core biopsy is definitely preferable because of the comparable diagnostic yield and more chances of lymph salvageability, because less chance of hematoma formation and contaminated hematoma in case of co-needle biopsy. So in a nutshell, these are the basic principles of biopsy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, show her IHC showed positivity to CD99 and NKX2.2. However, FISH for ESWR1 was inconclusive since the tissue sample was scanty.
So, hi Ramya.
Hi ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you loud and clear. So, can you just tell us, how when a child presents with either an extremity or an axial bone tumor, which we suspect to be malignant, as Kaushik has already said, that biopsy should be the last in line. So, how do we image and how do we stage these tumors?
Before I say, I'd just like to second what Sunil sir was saying, and we loved your presentation. The introduction was so amazing, and your correlations with everything, so it just caught everyone's attention. So that's nice. It was very typical of you, so that was very nice.
Thank you.
So coming on to the staging for malignant, for this case or any other malignant bone tumor, MRI and CT both are usually required by the surgeon. I'm sure Dr. Kaushik Nandi would be able to give more idea on that. But MRI and CT of the primary site, CT scan of the chest and bone scan are usually what are required for staging. Having said that, for Ewing sarcoma, PET-CT is an invaluable method for staging. If most centers today do have PET, and if PET-CT is done, you don't really need upfront all of the previous things that I just said. And bone marrow biopsy is not required if PET-CT does not show any uptake in the marrow. As far as latest data is concerned, that PET-CT, if there is uptake in the marrow, then you would. But if not, then that is enough to say that the marrow is not involved. At the end of chemotherapy, that point in time, imaging would be different. That would depend on the surgeons and what they would require for performing the surgery. But initially, if PET is available, that would be what we would do. But most kids do come with an MRI or a CT from, if they're referred to your center.
I have a quick question for Kaushik. Say a child has a mass in the upper end of the tibia. So when we are ordering the MRI, what exactly should we order for?
Sir, madam, for a kid having a tumor involving the proximal part of the tibia, the ideal prescription for any imaging may be X-ray or MRI or CT scan. It should be, if it's an X-ray, it should be a X-ray of the knee joint APN lateral view and covering the entire length of the leg, I mean the proximal and the distal joint, knee joint and the ankle joint. That should be the prescription for the X-ray. And for the MR and the CT, there is a cross-sectional imaging. Preferably, if it's a lower limb, both the lower limbs from hip to ankle joints should be screened for the lower limbs. For upper limbs, it's very difficult to screen bilateral upper limbs. At least the entire segment of the upper limb from the shoulder to the hand, that should be screened for any skip lesions.
Thank you.
So we further evaluated the child with MRI foot, which showed a lobulated heterogeneous lesion with inhomogeneous enhancement involving the right calcaneum. The whole body PET-CT showed disease on the right calcaneum with soft tissue component, and there were no other metabolically active disease seen. So the final diagnosis for this patient was Ewing sarcoma, right calcaneum, non-metastatic. As per our institutional protocol, she was started on neoadjuvant chemotherapy with alternate VDC and IE cycle.
I have a question for Raghu. Hi, Raghu, are you there?
Hi, ma'am. I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, Raghu, can you just tell us that what is the best way of giving chemotherapy in these kids?
So, as you rightly said in your presentation, pediatric bone tumors are usually managed with a neoadjuvant chemotherapy phase followed by the local therapy and the adjuvant chemotherapy. Now, in Ewing sarcoma, there is a bit of controversy regarding the treatment, regarding the optimum chemotherapy regimen to be chosen. For a while, we were considering whether to choose the dose-dense interval compressed chemotherapy or the 3-weekly regimen that we usually use. And there were two major protocols. One was the Euro-Ewing protocol versus the COG protocol, that is interval compressed chemotherapy. So these are the major issues that we face when choosing the optimum protocol. So what we know for sure is the combination of drugs to be used. The most active agents being ifosfamide, doxorubicin, etoposide, cyclophosphamide, and vincristine. So most of the protocols have used various permutations and combinations of these protocols. So the regimen that most centers, I believe, are familiar with is the use of alternating cycles of VDC and IE, either as a 3-weekly regimen or more recently, it's as an interval compressed 2-weekly regimen. So what we have been doing at our center is the interval compressed chemotherapy. For trying to improve the survival based on the reported improvement of around 8 to 10% by using the interval compressed regimen. Also, the main problem with this regimen is that the toxicity. And second, whether we will be able to maintain this dose density, whether we will be able to exactly achieve the 2-weekly gap between the cycles. So that is a problem that even we are struggling with. So what we generally observe is that the neoadjuvant phase, this is feasible to give the VDC and IE alternating 2-weekly. But as and when the local therapy progresses, especially radiation therapy, then chemotherapy, maintaining that gap becomes difficult. Also, maybe there is a slightly more incidence, but I wouldn't say that it is significantly higher than the 3-weekly regimen. And there was a recent abstract in the JCO which had sort of shown that the protocol, the interval compressed chemotherapy, seems to be better than the Euro-Ewing protocol. Some of the centers, including ours, were earlier using the Euro-Ewing protocol. So I think mainly it is to be a choice between the 3-weekly regimen and the 2-weekly VDCIE that is to be considered for Ewing sarcoma. Recently, TMH Mumbai also has come up with their own protocol. The results of that's probably the largest study, I think, of almost 200 patients. That is also definitely something which is worth looking at. But essentially, it involves the use of these drugs, VDC and ifosfamide etoposide.
Thank you.
So interim assessment MRI foot showed partial response.
So I have a question now for Rimpa. Rimpa, are you there? Dr. Rimpa?
Yes, I'm around.
Oh, hi. Rimpa, in this case, what should be the local treatment? Should it be surgery or should it be radiation?
So, there's enough, we keep having these discussions in our team meetings, as you are aware, that surgery has a definite advantage. I am not talking particularly for this case, but it's just the general declaration because I understand that this is largely a teaching session for fellows and students in training who are with us this afternoon. And if surgically operable, without mutilation, and clear margins are achievable, then surgery has an edge in terms of local control in Ewing sarcoma versus radiation alone after chemotherapy. However, the caveat here is you don't really want, these patients are often long-term survivors, they're responsive to treatment, and you don't want to land up with a deforming or mutilating surgery for a patient where there is another next best option. So coming back to this case, Arpita Di, if you want me to discuss this case, you remember we discussed very clearly that surgery here would definitely mean amputation with the foot gone. Kaushik was involved in the care, and we landed up planning radiation therapy for this child.
Is there any role of ECRT here?
Excuse me?
Is there any role of extracorporeal radiation?
Extracorporeal, okay, extracorporeal radiation is one of the options. But they are most usually extracorporeals are for patients where the volumes are large, there are higher doses are required. So we've had this experience while training in TMH Bombay with Dr. Laskar, where a significant number of patients were taken up for extracorporeal radiation therapy. However, when we choose radiation modalities, there are a number of things which are important. Extracorporeals, very high doses. You were discussing osteosarcomas in the past. Osteosarcs are tumors which are known to be relatively radio resistant, where radiation doses are pretty much on the very, very higher side. That could be one of the indications, but you have now newer modalities of radiation therapy. If you ask me in context of this patient, Arpita Di, then we were able to deliver, or rather it is very obvious that we could deliver good conformal radiation therapy to appropriate doses of 55.8 in this child without causing disfigurement, not even injuring tendons. And therefore, when you were discussing imaging, it becomes very pertinent for all of us to be on the same platform that for such tumors where soft tissue extensions can be notorious, MR is a very good imaging modality, especially for radiotherapy planning. And that I thought I should mention, because often if we miss these very treacherous soft tissue extensions, then marginal failures or even within treatment volume failures remain the commonest patterns of failure that you would see in poorly planned radiation cases. I mean, Arpita Di, it may be a good message to carry on to the fellows in pediatrics in this forum. I guess I'm the only radiation oncologist around here this afternoon. It may be a good idea for people who practice pediatric oncology in the community to rope in your colleagues early in the management of children, especially children and adults, but because I do mostly children, that's why I said children, so that we understand and we evaluate the extensions of local disease even before chemotherapy results in a dramatic response. So that's the other message I thought should just carry on to our colleagues and the young pediatricians in the forum this afternoon.
Yes, I think that is a very important message for all the trainees here, that please involve the other teams, especially the teams who would be delivering the local therapy, that is the surgeon and the radiation oncologist. Touch base with them, do multidisciplinary team meetings with them right at the outset, because afterwards the picture might change and they may not have the right feel of what was going on with the patient. Okay, shall we move on?
May I ask a question, Dr. Arpita, to Dr. Rimpa?
Yes, please.
Dr. Rimpa, thank you for that clarification. There is a practical question which we come across sometimes. If there is an extremity tumor, for example,
yes.
There's a radiation which has been planned as a local control, where extracorporeal radiation is possible and feasible. But at diagnosis, there was a good soft tissue component at presentation, which has resolved with your neoadjuvant. And at time of local treatment with extracorporeal radiation, What would be your take on that? There has been a significant soft tissue component at presentation, which has resolved at the time of local control.
Yeah, the basic principle, irrespective of the modality of radiation, Dr. Sunil, whether it is extracorporeal, whether it is, in situ radiation therapy after upfront chemotherapy, the basic principle is about margins. That's what maybe you're hinting at. And so what the usual standards for contouring for soft tissue sarcomas after chemotherapy response has set platforms. So what we usually do is follow those protocols. Anything that is a post-chemo residual disease is, of course, with gross target volume. So what we do is we do the MR fusion, the pre-chemotherapy as well as the post-chemotherapy MR, to be fused with the radiation therapy planning images. The gross tumor volume remains the post-chemotherapy residual, but the volumes that go up to high doses would be including the pre-chemotherapy soft tissue volumes. So they are usually very large margins for treatment. And if we find, so for this child with the calcaneal tumor, we didn't have a problem because anyway that whole zone with the soft tissue extension had to be treated up to 55.8 because she hadn't been resected. Our difficulties in identifying doses and volumes are mostly for skull base events. So as I speak to you, we have 2 kids on skull base events, where what we've done is whatever has regressed, because 55.8 radiation therapy dose is pretty high volume for the skull base in pediatrics, where the bone growth is not complete, where I am having to trying to balance doses to the ossification centers versus coverage well so as to prevent facial deformities, etc. And the consideration there, what we usually do when patients are not operated, is the pre-chemotherapy soft tissue volume. We take it up to 50.4 and we cone down to the post-chemotherapy residual disease to up to 55.8. And we try our best to respect germinal epithelium of unerupted teeth, of ossification centers, etc., but not at the cost of undercoverage of tumors or target areas.
So wouldn't that be a problem then when, the question I was asking you for extracorporeal?
Not necessarily.
How do you deal with the soft tissue component which was there, which has resolved, of course, now?
Yes, so in extracorporeal, the volume of treatment, so it's dead tissue being irradiated, and then the volumes are not compromised. What I mean to say is,
I think we have lost Dr.
Okay.
Dr. Sunil, what I would like to add is that I think we have lost Dr. Rimpa. Regarding the soft tissue component that was being discussed, actually, when you are doing the surgery and taking the bone out, the margins have to be maintained. That has to come out. Correct me if I am wrong, Dr. Kaushik. The bone is basically used as a scaffold. So you are taking the margins out along with the bone. So that is the basic idea. So otherwise, there is no point in giving ACRT alone.
Yeah, that's correct, Raghu. Raghu, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible now, ma'am.
I think, huh?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, Raghu. I mean, there is no doubt about that. So the volumes will never be compromised, be it a surgical marginal volume or be it a radiation planning volume.
Basically, in ECRT, the bone that is being radiated is just acting like a strut.
That's correct. Correct.
That's all it is doing.
So the principles of margin do not change.
Yeah.
Okay, so for this patient, she received radiation therapy for her local therapy for 6 weeks, and she completed her adjuvant chemotherapy in December 2019. So now she is 7 months off treatment. She can walk independently with any gait abnormalities, and the local examination of foot has only RT changes with no restriction of movements. So our second case is 11-year, 9-month-old boy from Kolkata who had a presenting complaint of pain in left hip for 3 months and limping. He was investigated outside with X-ray left hip showing normal study. MRI pelvis showed expansile enhancing mass in left posterior iliac bone, suggestive of Ewing sarcoma versus lymphoma. On examination, he was otherwise well, except for the local examination of mild swelling and tenderness on palpation over left hip joint. There was no restriction of any movement. There were no local regional lymphadenopathies noted. So MRI pelvis showed heterogeneous infiltrated lesion on the left iliac bone with soft tissue component. His biopsy was suggestive of Ewing sarcoma with IHC positive for CD99. His FISH as well was inconclusive for ESWR1. HCT was done for metastatic workup, which showed disease on the left iliac bone. There was uptake on the left proximal tibia, as well as in the right greater tuberosity. We further evaluated the MRI leg, which showed an irregular hypointense lesion with significant enhancement in the left proximal tibial metaphysis. There was also note of a tiny parenchymal nodule in the left lower lobe of the lung, so which was considered indeterminate in nature.
Maya, may I ask you, if quite a lot of the time we are faced with this problem where it's a very small, less than 0.5 centimeter nodule in the lung. So what do we do about these nodules? Because sometimes they are in very inaccessible places, we can't biopsy them, and you can never be sure whether they're metastatic or not. So how should we approach these, Maya?
So, hi Arpita. Hi. It was a lovely presentation that you did, and I second Sunil and Ramya, who, I think it was very nice and it was a very easy presentation to follow. So about indeterminate lung nodules, I think, yeah, we face this problem too, especially because very often even infections can just present as non-specific lung nodules, especially if they are so small. Generally, I think there are some very specific radiological characteristics. For example, if they are placed peripherally, if there are multiple nodules, here there's only a small nodule. Those actually pinpoint towards the presence of metastasis. So generally, if they're not biopsyable, and we are planning to treat the patient, we treat the patient with induction chemotherapy and reassess the lung nodules after induction chemotherapy. So I think that would be the best way to manage something that's indeterminate and which could not be biopsied at all.
Great.
Final diagnosis for this patient was Ewing sarcoma of left iliac bone with metastasis to right ischial tuberosity, left tibial metaphysis, and lungs. He was started with neoadjuvant chemotherapy with VDC and IE.
So Maya, again, because I think you are the person here who's in a center which sees the largest number of such tumors. In case of polymetastatic Ewing sarcoma, should we go for curative treatment? And if we do, what sort of outcome can we expect? What should we tell the families?
So here, there's this very large pelvic primary with a contralateral pelvic mets as well as a tibial mets, if I'm not wrong, with an indeterminate lung nodule. So this is extremely poor prognosis, especially because the bony mets are spread all over the place. It's not something which we can actually target and remove also either. Generally, I think at our center, we would probably go for palliative treatment because the outcomes would be, I think, 20%, not more than that. But if we do plan to go ahead with curative treatment, I think, some patients are often very keen on continuing treatment, on starting and continuing treatment. So I think the fair option would be like what you've done, start him on chemotherapy, especially if you are able to give interval compressed chemotherapy. That would be probably very good in this case. See how the response was, and probably give definitive radiation to all the to the primary as well as to all the sites of the mets, and then just hope for the best.
Yeah, that was going to be my question to Rimpa. So in such metastatic disease, obviously the question of surgery probably would not arise. And how would you radiate? In this case, in his case, there was large disease in the hip, but small disease in the tibia. But sometimes you get many areas of large disease. So in those cases, how do you give radiation?
So thank you, Arpita, for the question. And on a lighter note, I think I will second, third, and fourth everybody who complimented on your presentation. I think your presentation was really nice and very useful for students in the community. So coming back to radiation therapy planning for sarcoma. So sarcoma planning is complex radiotherapy planning given just defined by the virtue of the complexity of the tumor itself. So in this kid, as we all remember, well, just to give the background, he was a very fit kid and he responded well. So we have discussions on it, and that's exactly, Dr. Maya, how we treated him. And he got induction chemotherapy. And we had a very intense discussion about the number of metastatic sites and whether we should target everything. And we went all out for him because he was very fit. He tolerated his induction well. For these children especially, we are lucky to have a special equipment at our hospital called the tomotherapy equipment, which can treat a number of long therapy volumes. So even Tata Hospital Bombay has a number of functioning tomotherapy units. Although they are transitioning, and Tata Hospital Calcutta, we've got 2 tomotherapy units in which we deliver intensity modulated radiotherapy, which is a special form of radiation therapy. And the beauty of delivering treatment on tomo on long fields can be treated safely without unsafe overlaps, and we could do integrated boost to areas which had gross residual activity. So you didn't have to position and reposition the child in different ways to deliver this radiation, and you could just have a single treatment zone and image him every day before treatment. So it is somewhat complex, especially for this child where we were treating different sites. We had to keep bone growth and development of this kid in mind. But we had a long discussion with the family that first we have to save him, and later if he has pelvic and bone abnormalities, we would be requesting our orthopedic physicians to go in with procedures to correct limb deformities. And we delivered up to 55.8. He tolerated treatment well, after which you will be doing the rest of the presentation.
So his interim assessment PET-CT showed complete metabolic response, and he received radiotherapy for his local therapy for 6 weeks at the primary and metastatic sites, followed by whole lung bath. And he completed his chemotherapy in April 2019. So in his follow-up X-ray after 3 months, there was note of ill-defined nodular opacity in the left lung. We further evaluated with PET-CT, where there were in the various areas of the pelvic bone in the tibial metaphyse, proximal tibia, left proximal tibia, as well as there was active, metabolically active soft tissue in the superior segment of left lower lung. So suspicion was that the patient had progression of disease.
So Maya, again, this is a question for you. When there is suspicion that disease has progressed like this, this is for everybody, whoever has tuned in today. This story doesn't have such a horrible ending. But when you have such progression of disease, what sort of therapeutic options do we have as far as medical treatment is concerned? Maya?
I'm sorry. Yeah, this this is an early relapse. Yeah, it is almost like a progression, I think, because it's relapsed so early. But honestly, I would think that this is palliative. If it is, this was the lung as well as the bones as well, the previous bones, or the bones are still, I'm sorry to interrupt in between, but the whole body PET-CT, which shows the lesions in the femur, is that, are we considering that to be a metastatic disease?
That is the thing, you know, the story doesn't have such a bad ending after all. So can we just show what impression was?
So here, yeah, I'm sorry.
So later, after discussion with the radiologist, it was concluded that this was not consistent with metastasis. Rather, the pulmonary nodule was suspected to be infective, and the other sites of FTG average areas were attributed to post-RT changes and the muscle stress.
So that is the thing, you know, when this boy came to clinic with this image, and I looked at it, and my heart really sank, because this is a very, very lovely boy, a very nice family. And then when we went and, because it sort of seemed a bit improbable that he would suddenly explode with disease everywhere. So when you see scans like this, please do discuss with the radiologist and the nuclear medicine person, because it may not be disease after all, because a lot of things can cause FDG avidity. So you have to be very careful before jumping to conclusions.
So this patient was treated with a course of antibiotics, and then a follow-up scan showed a gradual regression of the nodule. So the latest X-ray only had bulky hyla, and then no significant abnormalities were seen. So he's 15 months off treatment now. He's ambulatory with not normal gait with full movement of the both lower limbs.
So again, question to Raghu. When we are following up these patients, how often should they come to clinic, and what imaging should we do? Raghu? Raghu, are you there? Raghu may have.
I'm here, yeah. Good one, mate. So it is about the disease status at the initial presentation, whether the child had metastatic disease. A child like this would probably need very close follow-up because he's at a very high risk of early relapse. So we would probably see him more frequently. So 2 to 3 monthly follow-up is recommended for most patients with Ewing sarcoma. And we don't generally recommend any routine scans or any X-rays apart from the chest X-rays. So which is done 2 to 3 monthly frequencies. And I would probably also closely watch the cardiac function, especially children who are receiving interval compressed chemotherapy. The doxorubicin toxicity is also higher. So the first 1 or 2 years, close monitoring for these issues as well. And depending on the local site where the surgery was done, where the radiation was given, we should have a plan for monitoring that site also for function, any other issues coming up in those sites. These are also to be considered while making up a follow-up plan for these children. So, no other scan would be recommended.
Thank you so much. Shall we move on to our next case?
Yeah, if I may, if I can just ask something. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Maybe I'm not sure if I heard it wrong or what I heard, but in your center you use Euro-Ewing. Is that what?
No. We used to use Euro-Ewing. We switched about 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay. Because I mean, did you find there was a difference? Because we use the COG protocol, and I mean the Euro-Ewing hasn't really shown that much of an advantage. Am I right?
It did not show any advantage, and in the beginning that was what we were using, and then beds were becoming very scarce, and in VDC, i.e. interval compressed, 1 block at least can be given on an outpatient basis. So that was the first reason why we switched. And then we looked at the evidence and saw, okay, we can do this. But really, I don't know about other centers, we are struggling towards the end. Counts don't seem to recover towards the end.
Absolutely.
And chemotherapy intensity is often lost.
Arpita,
we'll just move on to the next case.
Previous case about follow-up of an Ewing sarcoma. So along with the radiological follow-up, I think it's very important to do a CBC also at every visit, because because of the high dose of alkylating agents and etoposide that we give to look for a secondary AML.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Case number 3. There is 6 years, 3 months old boy from Mizoram who came with a history of pain and swelling above the right knee for about 2 weeks without any history of trauma, for which child was evaluated locally and incisional biopsy was taken. Then impressions from the biopsy was questionable Ewing sarcoma or osteosarcoma. After that, child brought here in TMC Kolkata for further evaluation. On local examinations, there was a presence of circumferential fusiform swelling about 37 centimeter in right lower thigh, which was warm and tender on palpations, and there was also presence of flexion deformity of the 60 degree of the right knee, and other systemic examinations was unremarkable. So we have reviewed the slight and block, which was there was the presence of metastatic osteoid, which was consistent with the diagnosis of osteosarcoma.
Okay, Ramya, again, I think you have covered most of this in the previous discussion. I just wanted to ask you, what is the role of PET-CT in osteosarcoma? Some people are still of the opinion that PETs don't really work in OS.
So, I mean, the reason why PET probably works in Ewing's is because it's a different biology as compared to, and the origin is different, which you had told in your presentation as well. Osteosarcoma is primarily from the bone. So MRI definitely of the primary site. Again, to reiterate what Dr. Kaushik and Dr. Rimpa was saying, involve the surgeon, especially in the beginning itself, for what imaging is required. So MRI of the primary along with the adjoining joints to look for skip metastasis is very important. CT chest is important because lung is the most common site for METs, and bone scan is recommended as much as possible. But PET-CT, however, doesn't have a role at all in osteosarcoma. So MRI.
Raghu, do you have any different opinion for that?
So yeah, so PET-CT for staging, definitely osteosarcoma, it does have a role in, so we routinely do PET-CT for staging, osteosarcoma. The concern here is whether the routine PET-CTs pick up the pulmonary nodules, because pulmonary nodules might be FDG non, and it may be missed if not CT thorax specific cuts are not. The lymph lysis of the thorax is recommended. So most of the oncology centers would have the protocol in place to separately screen the lungs also along with the PET-CT. So yeah, it definitely has a role.
So the fusion images would pick up the METs.
Yeah, I would say that PET-CT is not mandatory. CT scan.
Yeah, a CT thorax and bone
scan is definitely osteosarcoma. That's what I would say.
So initially we have taken the X-ray. So there was a presence of diffuse soft tissue swelling, along with there was a presence of periosteal reactions in the diaphysis and metaphyseal part of the right femur. An MRI was taken, which showed there is an abnormal marrow signal in the diaphysis and metaphyseal part of the right femur. Along with there was a presence of extraosseous large lobulated soft tissue component, which had the mass effect on the quadriceps muscle, which indicate there is a muscle invasions at places. Along with there is a extension of the tumor beyond the growth plate into the distal epiphysis, and the joint capsule and articular cartilage of the right knee, they are free from the tumor mass. At the same time, we have taken the PET-CT. The PET-CT showed there is a extensive lytic lesions, along with there was a abnormal reducer uptake in the diaphysis of the right femur without any presence of any other reducer uptake in other parts of the body. So ultimately, he was diagnosed as a non-metastatic osteosarcoma of the lower end of the right femur.
So I think chemotherapy, nobody wants to hear anything about chemotherapy in osteosarcoma anymore. Everyone has had more than a earful. So I think we'll just gloss over that and look at local therapy options. So question to Kaushik, what do we do for local therapy over here?
Madam, for this patient, as far as I recall, this was a patient from Mizoram, he's a 6-year-old kid. Yeah. So the available options for this kid was either to go, if we carefully look into the MR images, all the cross sections, screening from the hip to knee joint, there was a contiguous lesion starting from the distal metaepiphyseal region going up to the lesser trochanter and almost going up to the proximal femoral physis. There is a skip and a contiguous lesion. So the entire femoral compartment, the entire femur bone has to be resected. So the options available were only to go for a hip disarticulation. Number one, that will be a very mutilating surgery for this 6-year-old kid. Other options for limb salvage would have been a total femur resection and a reconstruction with a self-expandable prosthesis. And in our first constraint scenario, the self-expandable prosthesis costs around 13 lakhs, 13 lakhs. So with all the added complications and probabilities of revision surgery and so on. And the third option was a rotation plasty. Rotation plasty is classically not taken as a limb salvage. It is a kind of amputation, but there is a mechanical advantage. There is a below knee amputation is converted to a above knee amputation. So the energy expenditure of locomotion is greatly reduced. So here in this rotation plasty, the ankle joint is rotated 180 degree externally, and the foot faces backwards.
These are perfectly horrible pictures, Kaushik. They are total horrors.
The ankle joint acts as a knee joint. These are the intra picture showing the sciatic nerve and the femoral vessels, artery and the vein. And that part is a resected specimen, the thigh compartment. And this entire tibial leg compartment has been articulated with the acetabular socket, with the cruciates and the ligamentum teres in after 180 degree external rotation. This is a Winkelmann. This is a resected specimen. Yeah, this is a resected specimen. The shiny structure is the proximal femoral epiphysis. That was intraosseous involvement was there. And this is a particular type of rotation plasty. This is called Winkelmann type A3 rotation plasty. When the child will start weight bearing, the peculiarity of this type of rotation plasty is as soon as the child starts weight bearing, the proximal tibial epiphysis will remodel, just like a proximal femoral physis. Now, I hope, madam, this is a 1.5 years follow-up, and the child has started weight bearing since last 1 year. And if we do a plain X-ray, we can see, you can evaluate the proximal tibial physis has remodeled like a proximal femoral epiphysis.
Yeah, once everyone has stopped fainting and stopped puking, let us look at, oh my God, this is horrible. But so you have rotated it 180 degrees and put it back there. And Kaushik,
yeah, the triangular piece of
you'll be able to open run the video, lovely video, but I am not so tech savvy. But can you just tell us what we can see here?
Yeah, this is the immediate post-operative prosthetic limb. This is called the anti-gravity prosthesis, so that the soft tissue structures, ligaments, whatever you have repaired, that doesn't get strained. This is an immediate post-operative anti-gravity prosthesis, creating the weight of the limb hanging from the opposite shoulder, as you can see from the this band straps. And after the interval of around 2 months, he will be provided with he has already been provided with a definitive prosthesis. As you can evaluate, the leg, the foot portion is facing backwards and the heel is facing forwards. And when the child will do the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion of the ankle, that will reciprocate like a means a flexion and extension of the knee joint. So though this is a above knee prosthesis, the above knee portion has been resected, this limb will act like a below knee prosthesis, below knee amputee. So there is a gross mechanical advantage from locomotion point of view. This is the beauty of rotation plasty.
Yeah, it looks very unpleasant, but now we know how well this boy is working. I wish I could show the audience what it looked like, because Kaushik had sent a lovely video, but I am almost obsolete in these modern times, and I'm afraid I can't open it here. So thank you.
Once the patient is filled with the prosthetic limb, no one can make out. If the child, the knee level is the same level, both the sides, no one can make out after the fitting of the prosthetic limb.
Yes, that's true. I think we have already discussed the significance of necrosis in osteosarcoma. So he finished his treatment, and we move on to the next case. We just have time for one more case, and we'll hurry over this because I think we have precisely 14 minutes left.
Next is a 12-year-old boy from West Bengal who presented with swelling above left knee, which is associated with pain, and the child had difficulty in walking. Initially the child was investigated, and initial treatment was started elsewhere. And at presentation, MRI showed cortical erosion at the lower end of femur, and suspicion of chronic osteomyelitis was made. Later biopsy was done, which was suggestive of intermediate to high-grade osteosarcoma with no metastasis. And the child has received treatment according to Uramos protocol. And after 2 cycles of methotrexate, doxorubicin, and cisplatin chemotherapy, MRI showed, interim assessment MRI showed no reduction in the tumor. As local therapy, the child surgery was done, which is tumor excision and megaprosthesis replacement of left distal femur. And post-op histopathology showed 80% viable tumor with high-grade osteosarcoma with vascular involvement, and margins are positive. So at this time, after 6 weeks of last chemotherapy, the child consulted our center for second opinion.
Maya, question for you. Obviously, this is a very sorry state of affairs. What should be the advice now?
So it doesn't sound good at all because the necrosis is really so poor. And you already described how in osteosarcoma, really there are no further options. Once the necrosis is poor, there's no advantage of, there's no way to give radiation because it really doesn't work in this scenario in osteosarcoma. And upgrading the chemotherapy by adding newer agents doesn't work either. So pretty bad. The probably one thing which can be done is do a, probably have an amputation of this limb. That, although it's pretty sad because it's already a knee surgery, so it would be quite a lot of morbidity. So either we can amputate or just continue whatever we've been continue, and then just hope and see that, hope for the best.
Hope for the best.
So the family were counseled that high amputation will be the first choice, and the chemotherapy, even if it is given at later time, it might likely to develop local and distant metastasis. But however, the family opted for chemotherapy. And the child has completed treatment according to Uramos protocol. And 2 months after completion of chemotherapy, the child presented with a gradually increasing swelling on the dorsal part of left foot. And X-ray has showed a fracture at the proximal end of first metatarsal with a sclerosis at the base of first metatarsal. So at this time, the child had only localized swelling of left foot and the primary side has no swelling. So we want to consider for any local therapy as the tumor is so aggressive. And MRI was done, which showed involvement of the first metatarsal and soft tissues adjoining it, and also distal end of tibia is involved, and also calcaneum. And CT thorax showed metastasis in lungs.
So now again, question for Maya. What are the palliative options that we have over here? Obviously, there is no curative option now, but how can we make life a little easier for this child and his family?
So I think here there is a role for radiation as a palliation if there's a lot of pain or if the swelling is significant, or else we can just give him a dose of reduced, one dose of reduced dose chemotherapy, which is what we often give if patient presents with a palliative patient presents with metastatic fungating or very bad disease. We might just do that so that the myelosuppression is not very bad, but at the same time there is some symptomatic relief. Rimpa, I think we could give radiation also in this case. We have given to a few patients like this. What do you think?
Yes, I think I agree with your statement that the option is pure palliation. And it's only a matter of time before other bones start getting involved. So we would do palliative radiotherapy if the pain becomes a problem and if reduced dose chemotherapy is not being delivered. So yes, this is the only situation, and palliation underlies the same principles of symptom control and hypofractionation, so the treatments get over, children can go home with relief. That's it. I agree that there is nothing what is best or what is superior for this particular child and his family.
So I think the message in this case is basically, if you have positive margins, regardless of necrosis, even if the necrosis was excellent, if the margins were positive, Kaushik, you would still go for high amputation, wouldn't you?
Well, margin is a point where the oncosurgeons can't compromise. So there is a basic philosophy for doing the oncosurgery. If we can't offer the margin, then there is no point doing the surgery. If it's a positive margin for sarcoma, the only option is to do the revised margin. In this case, it will be definitely revision surgery with the amputation. But for palliative point of view, for this specific case, if there are other options for pain palliation other than amputation, because the amputation we have morbidity, adding morbidity to the mortality. So if there are other pain palliative options less morbid, definitely I will give a choice to the patient.
So if we could go back all over again, this child is no longer with us. If we could have gone back and if we could have convinced the family when they came to us with the results of a positive margin, should we have gone for an amputation at that time?
Madam, this case straight away goes to the above knee amputation. Above knee means just above the proximal most part of the prosthesis. The amputation, the bone cut should be just above the proximal most part of the prosthesis in the femoral stem. Because in the initial index surgery, there is a contamination of the margin. So we never know which compartment is contaminated or not. In the entire knee joint compartment is contaminated. So the revision has to go above all the safety level to the femoral compartment.
Okay, thank you.
Next, below-knee amputation was done later, but we lost the child after 4 months.
I think this is all we have time for today. Sunil, we have one more case, but do you think there is time for that? We wrap up here.
So I think people are dropping off. If there's any questions from the students, I think that maybe we can take a couple of questions if there are any. I think one of the questions which is kind of being there is multi. What is the question? Multicentric osteosarcoma versus skip lesions or metastatic bone lesions. How to differentiate? Anyone wants to take that? Maybe. Dr. Raghu, you want to take that?
No, I think that will be a very difficult thing to prove, metastatic versus this. But skip metastasis usually occur in the same bone, so that will help us to, anyway, the treatment is not going to change. The treatment remains the same, whether it is multicentric occurring in the same bone or whether it is a skip metastasis. So practically, I would just consider it as a skip metacentric.
So any other questions, please raise your hand, then we can unmute you, or we can unmute everyone, Ria, please.
If there's just one point which I would like to discuss, ma'am, is about, I mean, you can share your experience on that. When you use the high-dose methotrexate in osteosarcoma, there's this whole nomogram which is given for checking the levels and the amount of leucovorin. Is that something that everyone practices, checking the levels as far as this particular protocol is concerned? I mean, if Maya ma'am or Arpita ma'am or any of Sunil sir or anyone can tell what they do, because we've checked in a few children and it's very difficult to follow that nomogram. It's very confusing. Ultimately, everybody gets the 12 doses of leucovorin. So is there a difference in practice in that?
So as far as we are concerned, we haven't found much difficulty in adhering to this. So, and the other thing is that we don't see as much toxicity.
Yeah, exactly.
So same here, Ramya. We also have been doing what I agree with Dr. Arpita. In fact, we see probably more toxicity with the high dose methotrexate in ALL patients than in osteosarcoma patients.
Even more than high dose methotrexate in ALL, we see more toxicity with the Capizzi.
Yeah.
We have more problems with the Capizzi, more toxicity with Capizzi. But I think this 12 methotrexate is pretty well tolerated.
Yes, yes.
You can rescue them well.
If I ask, we have got representatives from various centers here, and I've been curious to know, actually, in our practice, what all we use. What is the chemotherapy in Tata? You use Dr. Maya for osteos.
So in osteo, we use a 3-drug chemotherapy, which is our own indigenous thing. No, we do not use high-dose methotrexate in the first line. So ours has got alternating cycles in different combinations. So there are 8 cycles of 3 drugs which are alternated. So 2 drugs per cycle. So cisplat, and IFOS. So they're given in different combinations. The total cumulative dose is 300 mg per meter square of doxo. So it's pretty.
So you're capping doxo at 300.
Yes, yes. Okay. And it's all given on outpatient. Yeah.
Dr. Arpita, what do you use?
We use the Uramos protocol.
So
with high-dose methotrexate.
What are you doing, Dr. Arpita, with doxorubicin? How much are you giving?
So we are sticking to the protocol. I think it comes to 3.
It's a full 450.
Protocol.
Yeah.
It's coming at 450 on Uramos. It's 450, and I have now, in fact, some of my fellows are also logged in from my center. We are now seeing, some of the cardiac toxicities, which are quite worrying. So I'm really not sure what's the right way to deal with that. Do we cap at some at 350, 370, and then probably replace last cycle with high phosphate something, because it's a worry now. I don't know whether you're seeing same phenomena at your center or not at TMC.
TMC with osteosarcoma, we haven't seen much of
yet, but it is too early to say that. We don't have that kind of numbers also to say that. So, but one thought, as you said, that to reduce the dose in the last 2 cycles from 75 to 50 or 60, and at least do it 25% reduction. That will make the dose around 3 cycles. Sometimes that is done, and some centers do that when they're using Uramos, not comfortable with the 450.
So Sunil, let me
always worrying once you cross 350, you always start worrying what's going to happen.
It's worrying, and that's the last cycle, which 70. It's almost 75 per cycle. So I think the last cycle makes a difference. The last one, if you give or not give, it makes a lot of difference. Yes. Sorry, Dr. Maya, you were saying something.
Yeah. So actually, so we don't use this, and anyway our doses are capped at 300 in osteosarcoma. But in the Ewing sarcoma protocol, which again is our adapted protocol, we initially used 360 mg per meter square of doxo. But the cardiac toxicity was around 10-12%, and it was always occurring at that last 2 doses of dox. Then we omitted the last dose of dox, so now it's at 300 mg per meter square. And although again now the duration of follow-up is different for the previous protocol and this one, we do seem to be seeing lesser toxicity.
So thank you very much. I think it was a fantastic session. I should congratulate Dr. Arpita, your team, as well as the excellent experts you have put together, especially Dr. Rimpa and Dr. Kaushik, who have been guests today for this session. So a very interesting session. I think lots of things got discussed today. And there has been a parallel chat session also going on, and Badra has been dealing with a lot of that parallelly as well. So thank you, Badra, for that silent contribution you have been doing in the chat box. So with that, we'll take your leave, and we'll see you again next Thursday. We have another interesting session on acute myeloid leukemia lined up for the next Thursday. We'll see you at 3:50 next week, and thank you again from on behalf of PHU chapter and my program committee. We thank you all, especially Neeta and Anand, who do a lot of this organizing work for us. So have a good evening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A special thanks to all the expert panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
It's special.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.